This video is now in session, and in yesterday's video, we talked about how taking responsibility is not necessarily a bad thing to do. And in many cases, when it comes to the presidency and to governorships, taking responsibility is a good thing to do. And in yesterday's video, we outlined an example. We gave an example of JFK's Bay of Pigs invasion speech and what happened after the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a failure for the United States in a campaign against Fidel Castro. So elaborating that example more and then going on to other examples, we can see how JFK was able to effectively gain percentage in his approval ratings for simply admitting that he did the wrong thing. So when it comes to the Bay of Pigs invasion, the context of this is that JFK originally wanted or was very adamant on invading Cuba, on overthrowing the Castro regime that was still in place in Cuba. And by the way, this was in the Cold War. This was still in the thick of it. So JFK was adamant on it. But then as the Bay of Pigs invasion started getting closer and closer, JFK started getting less adamant, and he started pulling out troops from the Bay of Pigs invasion because he didn't want the United States to be known as the ones who tried to invade Cuba. So when the Bay of Pigs invasion eventually came, it was much less troops needed much less troops than was originally intended, and it was definitely not enough troops to invade Cuba and to overthrow the Castro regime. And that was the premise of the Bay of Pigs invasion and the failure that it was. So JFK had two options. He could either deflect the blame either to his intelligence or to Dwight D. Eisenhower, somehow deflect it to Eisenhower, who was the former president before JFK, or the other idea is that he could accept responsibility, and that's exactly what he did. JFK, right after the Bay of Pigs happened, made a speech, televised a speech, accepting that he was accepting his mistake and that he was wrong to execute the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he outlined steps as to how he would improve on his plan with the Bay of Pigs, and how he would not try to make this mistake again. So that's something it's a concept you learn in in kindergarten. Most people learn in kindergarten, right? Accept responsibility. But surprisingly, for the presidency, a lot of presidents don't accept responsibility when anything wrong happens under their watch. But JFK did accept responsibility. And the fact that he did accept responsibility was actually pretty surprising because, again, presidents normally don't accept responsibility. So instead of smacking JFK in his approval ratings, Americans rewarded JFK's speech, and as a result, he shot up in the polls. He joked himself, "The worse I do, the more popular I get," and that's because he accepts responsibility. And he also made a joke that if he knew that he would have a higher approval rating because of this event, he would execute the Bay of Pigs invasion much sooner than he did. And this, by the way, happened just 2 months into his presidency. It happened on April 1991, just 2 months after he was inaugurated to succeed Dwight D. Eisenhower as president. So if you look at the polling, which if you've watched yesterday's video, you'll know this polling, but he was originally at 73% in his approval rating, but then he went up to 78% because of the Bay of Pigs invasion. This happened in April, so he went to 73 to 78, and then he went from 78 to 83. So in just the course of of 20 days, he shot up 10% in the polls because he admitted that he was wrong. Just by admitting that you're wrong, you get a higher approval rating by the American public. So that's the first sign of history to show with how accepting responsibility as a leader is actually not a bad thing. Another example is Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had a similar kind of scandal that plagued his presidency, and that involved the Iran-Contra Affair. So the Iran-Contra Affair was a thing set up by Reagan's advisors, where the United States would sell arms to Iran, and then they would use the money that they sold the arms to Iran to go against extremists in that area of the Middle East, to then use that money to supply the Nicaragua Contras who were battling the president, the gangs who were trying to overthrow the president of Nicaragua. So with that was the Iran-Contra Affair. That was the context of it. And a lot of Americans were upset that was happening. And a lot of Americans were initially upset at Reagan. And Reagan, instead of saying, oh, I had no responsibility in this was my advisors who did it. Instead of saying that, which technically was true, instead he said that he will take responsibility and that he was at fault for this Iran-Contra affair that happened under his watch. And that, once again, actually resonated with the American public. If you can look at the speech right here, but he admitted fault for the Iran-Contra affair. He admitted fault that he allowed this to happen, even though he was not directly involved in this decision to sell arms to Iran in exchange for money that can be provided to Nicaragua and its gangs. So with that, he shot up in polls. He went up to 64% in terms of his approval rating. If we look at 1986, that was 6 years, or I guess technically 5.5 years into his presidency, and you can see that he shot up right here. He shot up all the way to 67.7% in his approval rating in his fifth year. This was 1986. So yeah, this is the point where he shot up in polls. Now, it was temporary. It didn't last for too long, but at least it didn't give him, Americans didn't dip down in Reagan's polls. At least Reagan didn't go down in the polls. He went up. So that goes to show how accepting responsibility actually can help you as president. And there are also examples of those who don't accept responsibility doing badly. For example, Barack Obama and as well as George Bush, both presidents did not really accept responsibility for things that happened, for things that didn't go well under their watch. For example, Barack Obama, with the economy, he could have acted as if he was doing his best to experiment the best possible ways to give relief to the American public. But instead of saying that, instead of holding himself accountable, instead he blamed Bush for the lack of an economic improvement that happened in the initial days of his presidency. And because of that, he didn't really go up in the polls. He went down in the polls, and his honeymoon ended pretty early. Meanwhile, George W. Bush, he in the later years of his presidency, started to deflect responsibility for a lot of things that happened under his watch. The Iran war, the impending financial crisis, that all happened under his watch, and he could have taken leadership by saying that he was at fault. But instead, he deflected responsibility to his Secretary of the Treasury and let him do the bulk, let him take responsibility for the economic crisis. So that made him go down in the polls. You can see that in his 7th year of presidency, he really went down in the polls all the way to a low 23.9%. So that really that is an example of how not taking responsibility can actually hurt you. And a notable example is Donald Trump. Donald Trump, his whole presidency was about not taking responsibility for things that happened wrong under his watch. If you think about the things that happened badly under Trump's watch, like Charlottesville, and as well as the George Floyd protests and COVID, he didn't accept responsibility for anything that happened under his watch. He did not accept responsibility for the violence that happened under his presidency, and he deflected blame for the COVID-19 pandemic over to people like the Democrats, to Anthony Fauci, instead of taking responsibility himself, saying that he was wrong and that he has a plan of steps to do better. And that was one of the major reasons why President Trump did not become a two-term president, or at least not a consecutive two-term president. It's because he did not take responsibility in the COVID-19 pandemic, and he did not hold himself accountable for anything that happened during his everything that happened during his administration. He only took credit for things that happened he took credit for only good things that happened for his presidency, but he deflected the blame for anything bad that happened in his presidency, and that frustrated a lot of Americans who simply wanted Trump to understand that he had to take responsibility for the things that happened wrong under his watch, even if it was not directly caused by him. And that is how his approval rating was never able to get past the majority, except for just the first few days of his administration. For the entirety of his administration, he has been below 50%. So those are historical examples of taking blame and not taking blame. And now we have President Biden, who has decided to not take blame for the Afghanistan war, to not take responsibility, and instead, or I guess not to hold himself accountable, and instead deflected the blame to other individuals. And that will reflect in his polls, because he is bound to go down in the polls, because he is deflecting responsibility and not indicating that he is a president that can actually govern. So if he had accepted responsibility in the statement he made on August 16th to the nation about Afghanistan, if he took responsibility, he could have actually risen in the polls based on past precedent of Reagan and as well as JFK. And JFK, by the way, is one of Biden's few idols. He incredibly resonates with JFK, and the fact that he's not following JFK in an event, in this kind of event, is pretty surprising. But nonetheless, he will go down in the polls because he is deflecting responsibility as the president of the United States, the highest position of power in the world. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.